Welcome to the Tom Lee Institute's 2020 Tom Lee Month programming, Cocktails and Culture. And today we have Adair Margo with us, and she's going to talk about her latest book called Lydia, about Lydia Patterson Institute. And so we're very happy to welcome you here today, Adair.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, what motivated you to write this book in the first place? How did it come about?
Well, it came about, I got to know the school. Growing up in El Paso, I used to drive by Lydia Patterson Institute from the time I was a child, when my mother used to do volunteer work in the Segundo Barrio. But later on, when I became friends with Laura Bush, they were celebrating their 85th anniversary, and they asked me to be on the planning committee. And so I agreed, but that got me to go in the school. And then I met the students, I met the teachers. I just became enchanted with the school. I'd heard of it, but didn't really know it. So when it came time for their centennial, their president asked me, she didn't ask me to do it, but she asked me who might do it. And I, without knowing, I had no clue how to go about it or anything. I just said, well, I'll do it. And so that's how it got started. Their centennial was in 2013. So it's a little late, but the timing is perfect because they were just named a historic site by the Methodist Church.
Wonderful. So what is the significance of Lydia Patterson to this region?
Well, it's just an example of how we live on our border. It's a very interesting story. In particular, it's a Methodist school, so it's about the Methodists on the border, but how they responded to the Mexican Revolution and the times. 1913, when it was founded, there was a typhus epidemic. There was a revolution. There were floods of people coming over. They wanted a ministerial school, which is how it was founded, but they ended up responding to the needs around them. So it became much more, it never kind of lost that ministerial, learning the Bible, learning the love of God, learning the importance of bringing people up to be all that the Almighty intended them to be, that kind of mission. But it just grew into so much more than just training ministers. So it was really like training ministers in action, doing all kinds of things, from being a State Department employee to being a lawyer, or lots of other things.
So it wasn't just for American citizens. It was really started as sort of a missionary outreach to the poor in Juarez who didn't have an education. Is that right? Or did it also include people here?
It was never intended. At one time, and they still have students from Korea and other places in the world. But it was never intended for only U.S. citizens. It was intended really because Benito Juarez, when he was president of Mexico, the same time that Abraham Lincoln was our president, he allowed freedom of religion in Mexico. It was not founded separation of church and state. It was founded where the Catholic Church and the Crown were together. So Benito Juarez was the first to allow Protestant missionaries down there. And so as they were down there, they learned, as always happens when you don't have a variety or choices, when someone controls, doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Anglican or Baptist or anything else, it's, corruption, human nature can just, brings out the worst in you.
Right, yeah.
It brings out the worst in you. So ministers down there saw how little was known about the Bible, which is so important to Protestants, and so they wanted to start a school where they would train young people, like in Chicago, there's the Moody Institute. Same sort of idea, sort of a Bible school to teach people the Bible, men primarily, because women were still engaged in the church, but men, one person said there was sort of a bankruptcy of spirit. So there, in the spirit of John Wesley, they wanted to enliven the spirit again by training men how to, the Bible and how to preach back in Mexico. But the revolution sent them all up here. So they were kind of as close as they could get to Mexico as possible, with being in the United States and kind of protected by our laws.
Isn't that so amazing how a bad situation was used for good? you know. Really.
Well, that's when we respond. I mean, bad times bring out the character in people. When things are hunky-dory, we just rock along. But it's like you've got to be muscular and figure out what works. And then when they didn't have money, they had no resources. There were all these wealthy people who were coming over too. They wanted stability for their children, so they turned it into a boarding school. And then the ministerial students, who tended to be poor and the most uneducated, they served, they cooked, they made up beds, they did laundry for the students who could pay tuition. And today, all those students, most of them on scholarships, still clean their school.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing I wanted to talk about a little bit more. But you profiled 13 individuals in this story. How did you select these people, and how did you come up with this concept versus just writing about the history of Lydia Patterson?
Well, a story like that, I saw how important it was, but there was so little information, very little information. And so I knew it was going to be difficult. And then when you did find information, it was kind of only through the Methodist eyes, or it was only through, you know, one teacher who wrote a little bit about it. So I was a little bit fit to be tied. But then Tom Lee, and here we are, Tom Lee, when you have someone who has created a model that's timeless. And what finally dawned on me after several years, Tom Lee wrote The 12 Travelers Through the Paths of the North, where he took 12 people who passed through here, characters who had an impact on our region, to tell our history. So that came to me, you know, that maybe I could do it that way. And then when you do it that way, the individuals, and you could go from John Wesley, a Methodist, you know, who started Methodism, to Laura Bush, who was here for the 85th anniversary, to the first teacher, the first graduate, all these people who are also types of people, which is what Tom did, to tell the story. And when they're individuals, and finally I came up with the concept, let them tell it in the first person, because it seemed so stiff to me. And of course the Mexican culture is so engaging and personal. I wanted it in first person. So when you tell it in the first person, you're telling it in the context of life, your daily life. Like the principal, they boarded there. Her husband started the ministerial school. But she, in her chapter, could talk about who else was there when they were. I could go through census and find out that there were sons of a revolutionary general who were there at the same time. So it made sense for her, Mrs. Stevenson, to tell the story of some of the students and who they were. So it's all accurate, it's all footnoted, it's scholarly, but it's told in a very accessible, easy way. I wanted someone like my husband, or someone who's very busy, to be able to read it in 45 minutes time, have pictures, like a picture book, and get a sense of what that school's about. I wanted a calling card for the school.
Yeah, it is extremely readable and very something you can pick up and read a story and put it down and do another one the next night if you have it by your bed or whatever. Today we want to focus on kind of 4 people versus running through or sprinting through 12 people in a short period of time. And so the person you thought we should focus on first was John Wesley. And why is that?
Well, John Wesley, one of the graduates of the school, and he became a bishop in the Methodist Church, he said, you know, it's a Wesleyan school, Wesleyan, and that always stuck in my head when I was beginning my interviews. And so it's founded in the concept of John Wesley, which is really, it's very much a Christian concept. It's a human concept of human beings at their very best. And that is what he believed is the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But you acted on that. You didn't talk about it. So whenever they were preaching the gospel, they were doing for others. So that's exactly, I mean, I read a lot about John Wesley. I read about him at Oxford. You know, I read about how he was so moved by the porter who was so poor, yet so joyful. and how that porter really left a lasting impact on him. So I like to see what I found about John Wesley, and of course Methodism, it was a methodical way of going about things. It was really a pejorative term. They'd look at him, they called him the Holy Club at Oxford, those holy rollers, or making fun of them, and they were so methodical because they'd pray at a certain time, they'd do the sacraments at a certain time, then they go visit the poor at a certain time. They were so methodical, they called them Methodist. So that's how they got their name. And so I had fun really reading about these 20th century people who were still part of that kind of methodology, right, if you will.
Yeah. And so it really, as you read this, when you look at the profiles of especially the founding individuals, they were strong Methodists, most of them Methodist missionaries.
Right,
and so
most of them.
It really is infused into the culture of the school, without a doubt.
Is.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it was founded in 1914, and so why was it founded at that time? You mentioned the Mexican Revolution, but what was it about doing a school versus something else that they thought would be a good idea at this time?
It came about through philanthropy, and there was a man named Millard Patterson. He actually founded the first Christian church in El Paso. He was a fellow from Missouri who came out here to be a lawyer at a time when there were a lot of, after the Mexican-American War and everything, trying to deal with the border, land claims. So he came out to El Paso, made a lot of money, and he married his law partner's widow, Lydia Patterson. She died in 1909. They were married, happily married, and he made her a wealthy woman. He made the money, and so she had this a very regal bearing, but her heart was always in missionary work, not in society. She worked in the Segundo Barrio. She worked with Methodist missionaries in the Segundo Barrio, teaching young Mexican children, because there were so many, always being here on the border, you had children in another country who didn't speak the language, and there weren't schools to educate them. But the missionaries would, and she did. So when she died, the timing is really based on the fact that she got cancer. She died. There was a lawsuit with her daughter, but he ended up using his resources to establish a school on something that Methodist missionaries who had talked to them about it while she was still living, establishing this ministerial school. It was a ministerial school. So that was the timing. She died. There was a lawsuit. He ended up leaving town, moving to California, but he left money for the Methodists to establish this school.
Right. And so he actually used Henry C. Trost as the architect for the school.
He did.
And he's also profiled in the book.
He is.
And what was Trost's approach to the school and his vision for what it should be like?
Well, it was Trost, and then this was an interesting story to me. It was Trost was the architect, and then Mary Jo Melby, the Ponsford brothers were the contractors. And he had moved to California, but he'd say, build. This is what we want. Build it, and just draw down on my checking account. It's like get the money you need and make it happen. But Trost was such an extraordinary architect in El Paso. We've got so many of his buildings.
240 something. He did.
A lot, and he did do that school, which we don't have any longer. But he did it very economically. But what I loved is in his chapter when it opened. When it opened on New Year's Day, 1914. Someone from the El Paso Times or El Paso Herald walked through and said, every inch was filled with light. There was not a dark corner anywhere. Even in the basement, they had a gymnasium in the basement and laundry, and because it was a boarding school, but there were windows so that Trost would just plan in a way where, there were windows where the basement, which became the first Mexican YMCA, I think anywhere, began. So his approach was to build a very practical, economical building, and it had big porches. There's a picture in the book, great big porches, because he saw problems not by saying, this is my style and I'm going to do it my style. He said, no, I'm going to do it the most economical way, but in a very attractive way. So they had these great big porches. And downstairs, of course, it would have been shaded, which you need shade when you live in El Paso. And then upstairs was a sleeping porch that was screened in. So it's fun to read about what the
concept was.
What the concept was.
Well, during the time that it was built, it was really a very tumultuous time, as you mentioned, for the Mexican Revolution. But people don't realize, what it was like in El Paso at that time. And interestingly, Tom Lee's father, Mayor Lee, Tom Lee, he's actually Tom Lee II, and Tom Lee, the artist, is Tom Lee III, but we call him Mayor Lee just to keep it simple, was the mayor at the time. And I thought, when you look at Millard Patterson and you look at Mayor Lee, they were both men kind of cut out of the same cloth, very other-focused, very much wanting to make a difference in the city. And so how did Lydia Patterson affect what was going on at the time? Because El Paso was kind of a Wild West town and in transition, and people were really trying to clean up the city and that sort of thing, and Mayor Lee was a big part of that. And I think Millard Patterson, in founding the school in his own way, was making his mark, his contribution to improving the character of the city.
Right. He definitely was. He was a churchgoer. He was, Mayor Lee was not. His wife was, but Tom used to say he'd go hang out at his law office, and periodically would go to the Baptist church where my great-grandfather was a minister. But yeah, there was a whole lot going on then, and they both, they both in very different ways. Mayor Miller Patterson was a abolitionist. I mean, he because he saw so much drunkenness. You're trying to get away from that, which they were different men, but both trying to do the same things in different ways, and that is provide opportunity for people. The YMCA was a way for people to become acclimated in doing sports and other things, and not only gambling and drinking and a lot of the things that were going on at the time. Yeah.
And one of the other people that you thought would be good to highlight is Mary Watson, the teacher. Can you tell me a little bit about her contribution and why you thought she would be interesting?
Well, she was one of the original teachers. It was interesting to me because Lydia Patterson kind of advertised themselves as, very trained faculty, and there were like 5 of them, and they all taught everything, music, English. But Mary Watson she had been a missionary down in Mexico and came up here. She was the first one that a missionary named Reynolds. He became the first president that he hired because he ran into her husband. They had to flee Mexico during the Revolution. He ran into her husband here. She was back in Georgia with her parents. They were looking for work, and Reynolds says, I need a teacher. And he got her. And she ended up, because of the Revolution, she ended up developing this English as a second language, and English classes were really Lydia Patterson. In El Paso, we have so many firsts, but we never claim them because we're so far out here, we're going, well, maybe someone else did it first. Well, until someone disputes me, I'm going to say it was the first English as a second language program. Extraordinary, and she did it. And in her narrative, when she's telling her story, I mean, they had people from all over. One fellow was a Hindu who had been converted, and he wanted to get into Georgetown University, to seminary, to become a minister. And so he needed Latin, and the president not only was teaching, it wasn't just Spanish to English, but he was a Hindu, Farsi or whatever he spoke, and he needed, he knew some English, but he also needed Latin. She didn't want to teach it because she didn't like Latin when she was studying in school back in Georgia. And the president, I loved the way his response to her, he says, how would you feel if you were in a foreign country and didn't speak the language and no one would teach you? So she said, she wrote this herself, she says, I taught it. He actually did very well and got into school, you know? So she has wonderful stories, but she came to represent the teacher. She's not the only teacher. There were lots of other great teachers, but she was so significant because she was one of the very first.
So she really innovated the concept of ESL, or English as a Second Language, which really, hadn't been conceived of before, that you had to teach English differently to somebody who's not a native speaker than you would, just putting them in an English class per se.
Well, and they did it, you just immerse them. Right. I mean, and Jose Cisneros told me that, how you had to get agile at English to be able to speak it and understand it, and then you were put into the grade level where your capacity was and moved from there.
Right.
So it was, it was emergency times. You got them in and got them out. Right. But it's made a huge difference. So many people, we had Chinese, or there are stories of Chinese who came to learn English from Juarez so that their children could work in curio shops in Juarez. But all of them ended up becoming engineers, and what God, their greatest talents is what they were after.
Right. Well, when you look at the whole concept of not only including, Mexicans and native Mexicans, but people from all over the world, that's a very extraordinary environment, to be, something that would not be usual. That's
not
for sure.
usual. And not only that, but it became kind of a meeting place for all these refugees, missionaries from all different denominations who are trying to figure out how are we going to get back into Mexico, because they love the people there. So it became this environment. It's sort of like communities in schools, but more than that, it was like the world in your school. Right. So to live in that, they said, Mary Watson said, it had its challenges, no doubt, but it also was a very enriching environment. They just, were doing what needed to be done.
Right. Yeah, it would have been a unique situation to have extremely poor people alongside very wealthy people, the students of wealthy people, very unusual.
It's unusual. It's not so unusual in El Paso. Because things I've been involved with, this school being one of them, FAMAP, a hospital in Juarez, they serve the poorest of the poor, but they serve them so well that middle-class people from the United States, they'll go to their hospital seeking the same thing. So that's a beautiful concept where you give the poorest the same level. In fact, you work extra hard for them because they need an extra lift so that other people are attracted to and then can pay their way and help balance things so you can make it work economically.
And so as the student, you selected Jose Cisneros.
I did. And that's the real Tom Lee connection to this, because Jose and Tom became very good friends. But Jose Cisneros was a refugee from Mexico. His story is in here. I'd done Tom Lee's oral history. I'd done Jose's oral history. His family lost everything, came up to Juarez, dirty, lousy. As Mayor Lee said, people think he was calling people names, but really, Jose, they were. I mean, they had really, the way they'd had to live and feed off acorns, no change of clothes, things like that. It was a dire situation. But they ended up in Juarez in 1925, and one of the, you have a school over here that teaches English. It's like a magnet. So he got a pass to come over to Lydia Patterson, be able to study on this side of the river. Mm-hmm. And he loved his history teacher. He began learning history. He really had not had much schooling at all. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story. In fact, in the special edition of the book, which we're selling for $5,000, it's boxed, but it's signed, and it also has a print that Jose did, a drawing of an old shoe that communicates a lot about a hard journey that's in the special edition.
Yeah, I understand he and his family traveled almost 1,000 miles on foot, and just it was heartbreaking. His father, I guess, didn't really survive mentally and emotionally the whole trauma of the journey, and so Jose had to go to work immediately and go to school at the same time.
Burying his little brother on
Yeah,
the road,
right.
nothing to bury him in, so they wrapped him in a cloth.
Right.
Seeing his granddad hanging from a tree as they left Mexico and they had nothing to cut him down with. I mean, things like that.
Yeah, it's unimaginable.
But the thing that Jose too, there's such, and these are his actual words, there was such a spirit, there was never an ounce of bitterness to him. He was so grateful about everything that happened in his life because he got to come to the United States. And the story is in there too. He later got a job doing window dressing in downtown El Paso. He went to watch Tom Lee do his mural in 1938 at the federal courthouse, and he said he would stand in the corner and just watch him silently, and he was too afraid to open his mouth. But he one day shared drawings with him, and Tom Lee was very complimentary. I'll always remember Jose saying, I knew he didn't think they were bad when he smiled. But Tom introduced him to our librarian, who actually gave him his first exhibit. And he died a very famous draftsman from El Paso.
Right, yeah. So what about his relationship with Tom Lee? That was kind of the beginning of it. And what sort of, did they remain friends after that? And
They did remain friends. I came to know Tom very, very well in 1993, but I remember when we named the Tom Lee Gallery, and we had dinners, and Jose was on the advisory board with the Bushes and people from around the state. But whenever they'd see each other, I always loved the way Tom would see him and go, Joe! And Jose would say, Tomas! They'd give each other an abrazo. So without saying much more, it just communicates what our community's all about. This respect for one another, doesn't matter where you came from, what language you speak. We're here together on this frontier, and we help each other. And Tom did do that. Tom didn't talk to me about it, which he probably wouldn't have, but Jose did. And he would say, like, sometimes Tom would have a rancher friend come, and Jose loved drawing horses, but he rarely got to see him. And so Tom would ask him over, and he'd show his drawings, and the rancher, or it may have been a veterinarian, I can't remember, but would give him advice on the musculature and things like that. So just remembering each other and helping each other. And also when Tom went to World War II, of course, Jose did a lot of work that Tom probably would have done if he had been in El Paso. And that was, for the 12 Travelers book, it's initiated as menus for the Paso del Norte Hotel. Tom never finished them, the 12, so Jose finished some. So the original ones that became menus had drawings from Jose, and some King Ranch work Jose did, not during the war, a little bit later, but he was able to do a lot of work by knowing Tom Lee.
right. And that's saying a lot that Tom would sort of allow him or encourage him to pick up that work, because Tom himself was a perfectionist and never had any apprentices or anybody doing anything of his work. It was all completely his. So I think it says something of what he thought about Jose.
But what I love about Tom too, when he did his book, The Wonderful Country, the inside cover, he illustrated his own books, but the inside cover is done in crosshatching, which Tom Lee normally didn't do. I mean, there's some pieces, but he normally didn't do crosshatching. That's Jose. That's all Jose did. He learned to crosshatch, and he'd do it real tight when it needed to be darker. So when Tom did that book and the inside cover, I remember seeing a letter somewhere. I'm not sure where it is now, but he sent Jose a little drawing or maybe the book, and he said, "Your influence." And that's true. That's true. We learn, we learn from each other always. It's not like I'm the great master, you learn from me always. And I love that, but the fact that Tom Lee acknowledged that and elevated him by acknowledging that. And also, I always love this story because when Jose had a book written about him before Tom did, John West at the university did a beautiful book about Jose, Printer at the Pass. And when it came out, Jose sent a copy to Tom, and he inscribed it to him, "It's all because of you." But I saw the letter Tom wrote back to him, and it basically told Jose, "No, it's not. It's because of you. It's because you're the one with the desire. You're the one that pushed yourself to get here. But congratulations, and that's graciousness. So it's such a good lesson on how, when we help people, how you do it, and never kind of puff yourself up thinking, well, I'm responsible for that. Well, no, we never are. Anyway, I love that story.
Right. In one of the curricula we have for middle school, the Tom Lee Institute produces curricula, we profile the relationship between Tom Lee and Jose Cisneros and tell the story of the Mexican Revolution through their eyes.
That's
and
right.
one of my, and Jose represents the character quality of determination. And we tell this wonderful story, I don't know if you could retell it, about how he had saved some money and went to take a painting lesson from someone outside that was right outside his school, and what they said to him and so forth.
Right. Jose was always saving money to buy books, but he did say he used, and that was early on, that he took his lunch money and paid a street painter. Sounded like, when he told me, it was like on his way to school. But anyway, he got his paints all muddled. The guy kind of taught him about the color wheel. And he got the paints all muddled, and so it turned very muddy. And the little street teacher let him know that he should forget art and he'd become a good bricklayer. And Jose, he found out then that he was colorblind, which he was. But he usually used colored pencil. He used some paints, but he said his daughter would just tell him what color to use because he really couldn't see the colors.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Talk about determination.
Yeah, exactly.
And, wow.
That's not going to slow me down.
Yeah, no, that was something else. And then when he was at Lydia Patterson, he took ESL classes to learn English, and then they placed him in the 3rd grade, and he would have been a teenager at that time?
Yeah, he would have been. But he had never really been able to be educated in Mexico. And his father, he said, it was called a silabarico metódico, or it was an old, like a way to teach letters and things that the Spanish had used, that Jose said his dad began teaching him. And then on his way up, he lived in Valle de Allende for a while, and an uncle took him to school, but he really had very, very little schooling. And at Lydia Patterson, he was able to, wherever they placed him, he was able to finish the 8th grade. But he never graduated from high school.
Right, yeah. And so when you think about, the characters in the book that you portrayed, what other characters come to mind as having had a significant impact on the culture and the history of the school that people might be interested in?
Well, one of the graduates that a lot of people have probably heard of is Tin Tan. He wasn't a graduate, but he learned English. And so one thing that really became so clear to me, the whole idea of Spanglish, you can put it down all you want, or the Pachucos called it calo. But it's an interesting phenomena when you live on either side of the border, and really the main intent is not to be a perfect grammarian, it's to communicate. And Tin Tan made it funny, so he became very famous. I mean, in Mexico, dozens of films, and he was a dancer, and there's a statue of him over in the plaza in front of the mission in Juarez. But that's an interesting, because that kind of, an artist can kind of bring it together, the way you cross a bridge and you end up with your life and your language bridging too. And you hear that Jose Mario Sanchez Soledad did a very good job of communicating that in his They're all part of the legacy, which are several graduates that we put in the last chapter.
And so when you look at the legacy of Lydia Patterson, what can you say? I mean, it's still influencing, it's still impacting lives.
Yeah, in a huge way. And what I'd like to see, I said I wanted this to be a calling card, but I think, when things are so old and people have been there so long and it's not that well known, but there's still not that well known, but an enlivening, it's enlivened again to continue the next 100 years. I'm hoping this might be a little spark in that, where more people and a broader public, as they learn about our border, it's about the U.S.-Mexico border, and all the narrative will become about a wall. And even us who live here, we know it's not a wall, it's a fence. It's like your neighbor's fence, it's, and so these are real life stories of how we actually live, how we straddle. And though it seems like everybody in capitals may be fighting against us, you can't divide the heart. And we're helping each other on both sides. And anyway, to me, it's just a beautiful story.
So there actually are today hundreds of students walking across the bridge from Juarez and coming over to Lydia Patterson to study.
Not in the time of COVID, but now but this is another thing. They had transitioned so that every one of those students had an iPad. So they're all learning virtually in Juarez. Right. So their education has never stopped. And another thing, it became so clear to me, a lot of those students living in Juarez are U.S. citizens. Mm-hmm. They were born in the U.S. Their parents may have been farm workers and then were deported. So the children go with them, and then they're in this no man's land where they can't go to school there and they can't go to school here. Who takes care of them? So we want to see them as well educated as possible. They're going to end up in our country. And listen, when we took these students to Dallas parents were saying, what is it about you? We want our children to have it. Because they're so mature and they're so grateful for having been given an opportunity.
Yeah. So what's in reading this book for people who have no connection to Lydia Patterson and no connection to El Paso?
What's what?
What's in it? How can they benefit, or is this primarily aimed at alumni of Lydia Patterson and El Pasoans and so forth?
I love what the blurbs on the back. I'm very proud of that we got such wonderful comments from very renowned people. One of them is Dana Gioia, who was head of the National Endowment for the Arts, poet laureate of the state of California. But I liked the way he said, this is an important part, this is an important local history, but it's so much more. It is a visionary volume that communicates that when Christian charity and philanthropy come together, a world of difference can be made. So it's a visionary volume.
Right, there you go. And so I know, just reading it myself, of course I know about Lydia Patterson, I know about El Paso, live here. I just thought the stories themselves were very interesting, and I love biographies, so this is definitely one of my favorite reads, that's for sure. And so what, your final thoughts about having done this project and how it impacted you?
Well, I love doing it. It took me 8 years. I struggled with it. It's like it wasn't easy for me to do. And I'd get up in the middle of the night and I'd just hammer away. A lot of it was just hard work, digging through obituaries and these old journals from missionaries down in Mexico. But when it finally came together, I learned a lot. Tom Lee was so disciplined and he worked so hard. There is no shortcut to success. I'm happy with the book, so whether anyone else likes it, I'm happy with it. I feel good about it. I like to read it over and over again because of what I learned, but it was hard work. You can read it in 45 minutes and it took me 8 years to figure it out. I know I'm slow, but anyway, I learned that, but I also, there is so much good news in our world that we never hear about because it's buried. And so rather than flashes and pans, or you try to go where there's a spotlight, which is most of the time on negative things, if you ever find yourself close to that light, if you don't become part of that same narrative, use it to share good stories like this, because they're life-changing. They enliven. I mean, I feel enlivened from having written this book.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
Well, the proceeds of the book go to Lydia Patterson, is that right?
that's right.
Yeah.
They all go. The book is the publisher, so all the proceeds from the sale go to the school.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Adair. This has been fascinating. We appreciate you taking the time to come by.
Thank you, Holly.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us for this Tom Lee Institute production about La Lydia.